Stephen had no idea what to do when Keto started to dig into the grave. She was too strong to be stopped by him alone. He wanted to call for help, but before he could press the dial tone, Keto stopped digging and started barking. She had found something. Stephen nervously looked over the edge of the hole. His jaw dropped when he saw what Keto had uncovered. Stephen knew he needed to call the police. What Keto had dug up here, he just could not explain what it was doing here. He barely knew what it was. And when he explained it to the police, at first thought it was some sort of practical joke. When they arrived to check it out for themselves, they realized Stephen had been telling the truth all along. But none of them had any idea about the scope of Keto's find and what consequences it was going to have. But this would only be a matter of time. In the next couple of days, dozens of arrests were made, all because of what Keto had dug up in the graveyard. Stephen is so happy he was not able to stop her that day. But what did Keto dug up in that grave? Why was the find so significant, and how did it lead to so many arrests? Stephen and his husky Keto took a walk together every afternoon when he got home from work. She was always gentle and sweet, but one day, she started behaving strangely as soon as they got close to an open field. Keto was pulling against Stephen so hard that he could barely keep control of her. What had caught her attention? Keto went from pulling on the leash to actively fighting against Stephen. She'd never acted that way before in her life. Stephen lost his grip, and she sped away down the narrow street. Stephen was thankful that few cars went through the area, but he had no idea where she was going. He chased after her. Once she had passed the two houses and the open field, Stephen realized that his dog was running for the old graveyard. He started to feel uneasy. Hardly anyone went there anymore since there was a newer, larger cemetery in another part of town. Reluctantly, Stephen jogged down one of the trails after Keto. Just as he'd suspected, there wasn't anyone else in the graveyard. Stephen could easily see Keto in the distance, though he was far too slow to catch up with her. As he looked around, he noticed that there were flowers on many of the graves. It surprised him. After all, it wasn't exactly an ordinary cemetery. The graveyard was actually a military cemetery. In good weather, visitors would easily be able to read the names on the small metal plates below. But it was deep in the heart of winter, and the snow blanketed the entire graveyard. It was white crosses against white snow. Keto was still interested in something nearby. Keto froze and almost looked like she was getting ready to run away. After hesitating for a moment, the dog leaped forward and dug her paws into the snow. She tore at the grave, disturbing the flowers and sending petals flying. Stephen was horrified by the sight. He sprinted over to Keto and grabbed her collar with both hands. Keto ignored Stephen's attempts to pull her away and continued lunging at the grave. Embarrassed, Stephen looked around the cemetery for help. Stephen saw a sign by the front gate and thought maybe the groundskeeper was nearby. Plus, he needed help getting Keto's attention. But before he could reach the front gate, he was distracted by a sudden bark. Stephen made his way back up the hill. What had she found? Stephen knew that he should have called the groundskeeper and respected the privacy of the person buried there by staying away. It wasn't right to snoop on another person's grave. But Keto was so intensely fascinated by what she had found that Stephen couldn't resist. He had to know what had made his dog act out that much. Keto had dug through the snow and around the nameplate at the base of the cross. The dog was obviously excited by her find. When Stephen finally peered down into the hole that Keto had made, he almost stumbled back in surprise. Stephen fumbled with his phone. He had to call the police. Stephen had expected to see flowers or some kind of trinket in the hole. He doubted that Keto could have dug deep enough in the cold earth to uncover a casket. At the bottom of the hole, Stephen could see that the nameplate had holes drilled into it. It appeared to extend much farther than what Keto had managed to uncover. He shined the light from his phone on the plate and stared at it, trying to understand what he was seeing. Using his foot, he cleared off a patch in front of the next grave. Once Keto caught on to what he was doing, she helped him dig. It was exactly the same as the first grave. Stephen checked several graves and found plates with holes on most of them. He searched for another grave with flowers and started to dig. As Stephen uncovered the grave with the flowers, he saw the same holes in the plate. The graves with flowers all had holes drilled into the nameplates. What did it mean? Stephen wondered if they were air holes to some kind of cage or even the casket below. They seemed to extend far down into the grave with the holes leading up to the surface. If there was something down there that didn't belong, then maybe Cato had sensed it. Stephen returned to the graves with the flowers and inspected each in greater detail. He wanted to be able to give the police the best possible description. But as one might expect, the police were not that easily convinced of Stephen's story. It all just sounded completely ridiculous, and they figured it was probably a prank call or something. Stephen didn't know how to react at first, but he was determined not to let this go. Only when Stephen kept persisting and sent a couple pictures from a hole that Cato had dug was the police willing to send a squad car. The officers were still doubting Stephen. Stephen knew he did the right thing to call them. But every time Stephen would come close to the dug-up grave, Cato would react. There was something there that he did not like, that was for sure. Stephen didn't really want to touch the other graves just in case he would mess something up before the police arrived, but man was he curious. So he just carefully started sweeping a bit of snow off one of the graves. What he then noticed was something that he had not seen yet because he had only inspected the nameplates. But the ground on the grave looked like it was covered by dirt. There was not a blade of grass to be found. And indeed, this was also the case for all, and only the graves with flowers. Then the police finally arrived. He had to explain to them what was going on here and what he had found. He had a weird feeling about all of this. Two young officers got out of the car laughing a bit and just not being that serious by the looks of things. They thought they were going to meet a confused man with his dog. Stephen had to keep Cato's leash on a tight grip when the officers inspected the hole that the dog had dug. They were absolutely stumped by what they were seeing. Stephen also explained his other finds in relation to the flowers on the graves, the holes in the nameplates, and the fact that all these graves seemed to be fresh. Suddenly gears started to turn for one of the officers. It was like he got a strange feeling what was going on. It was obvious that the flowers had been to mark the graves. Someone needed to know which to dig up, or maybe that already happened. And judging by the steel box with holes, these were not graves, these were temporary storage. And for who? The officers made a couple of calls back to the station, trying to get permission to dig out the steel box that Cato had uncovered further or to cut through the top. Luckily, they had been smart enough to pack the right equipment. At the station, they did some checks, and one of the officers quickly discovered that this whole graveyard actually was not listed anywhere. It was like it was set up just to bury some things here. If it didn't exist, there would most likely also be no actual graves there. So the station had no problem with the officers doing whatever they had to do to get to the bottom of what was going on there. So what was this? The metal cutter quickly came out of the car, and one of the officers started making a large hole in the metal box, while the other officers inspected the other graves. Stephen was still just trying to keep Cato calm. When the first officer finally finished his hole and showed his light in the box, his eyes went very wide, and he was at a complete loss for words. But before he could say anything, the peace and quiet were suddenly disturbed by increasingly loud music. What in the world was going on here? The other officer came rushing back and said that another car was approaching. If these people had something to do with this, they needed to catch them in the act. So they needed to hide quickly. Luckily, the police car had come from the complete another side as to where the music was now coming from, so that was already out of sight. Stephen kept Cato silent, and everybody was on high alert. Stephen was just really hoping that he could keep Cato silent. Then they saw the car approaching the entrance of the graveyard. Then the car came to a full stop. The officers could see them looking at a map for a second before walking towards one of the graves. They were obviously in on the whole thing, and now they could catch them in the act. They were still quite relaxed at this point, but that immediately changed when they saw that the nameplate of their grave was uncovered, and they noticed the giant hole at one of the other graves. They started to look around. One of them looked like he was about to faint. The officers saw that they started to panic and knew that they had to act now before these guys made a run for it. They jumped out to the bushes, equipment drawn, and arrested the guys. The guys did not realize at first what was going on. They looked completely lost for words. And the police lucked out big time with this arrest, as it would prove to be the final piece of the puzzle. These boys were very young and very afraid to go to jail, so they were willing to confess everything to avoid it. So they started talking. Apparently, this place was indeed not a graveyard, but a secret distribution point for large and expensive imported items that could only be on the very black market, so to speak. All the different graves with boxes were different orders for customers. There was one organization that specialized in smuggling these items into the States, and they used these by themselves to create fake graveyards as places to store the item for their customers to come to pick up on their own. After payment of the course, and it seemed like a great idea, as who in their right mind would go and dig up a fresh-looking grave with flowers? Who but a very curious dog that had gotten a scent through one of the air holes? Keto was the hero of all of this, who had uncovered